Thank you for the.
Jimmy, I know sometimes you forget.
I think sometimes I forget all the time. Okay.
Recording in progress.
There you go.
Thank you again, Carolyn. It's such a treat to be here with so many friends. The more I come, the more friends I make. I've already in this class made 2 friends. Got a family last Sunday go to Boar's Head, and from this class, and boy, were they knocked out. And I'm always going to encourage you to go whenever you can, next year hopefully. Also this morning, I want to recognize a gift that was given to me by my dear friend Paul Bruner. Paul Bruner, if you could awaken and listen up. So I have been teaching humanities for 53 years.
Wow.
And yeah, right. Easy for you to say. But anyway, one of the things that I teach, one of the areas I teach art history. And Paul sent me a videotape sometime last year of this guy named Janicek, who is a famous art historian in England, on the art movement called the Baroque. And that piece just knocked me over because you can get everything straight.
We can't see it.
No, okay.
There you go.
Thank you. That knocked me over because I did not understand the true complexity of the Baroque. And I realized, come on in, please. This is the family that was at Boar's Head last week. And so they deserve our applause and attention. Yeah. Thank you for going. Did you learn anything? Did you have a good time?
Oh my God, that was beautiful.
Yeah.
That was beautiful.
So I hope you'll listen to that and take that to heart next year when it's time to go. So anyway, back to Paul Bruner. By the way, Paul. There's nothing that Paul Bruner isn't interested in. I mean, the man's interests go everywhere. And so he sent me this piece, and it just knocked me over because I had no idea that the Baroque was born in the Counter-Reformation. The most counterintuitive event in art history, I'm sure. Anyway, this summer, every year, I do a series in this class in June on Tuesday evenings, and I'm going to, the title of it, Carolyn, so you'll know, is Going Baroque in the Counter-Reformation. And it explains how this impossibly wonderful cultural and art event could come out of this most repressive return to orthodoxy, straight-laced movement we call the Counter-Reformation. I was flabbergasted, and that's given the fact that as long as I've been teaching that particular area, I was overwhelmed. So anyway, I'm going to do a whole series on that and explain the Baroque and why the Baroque is so important. And I'm going to tell you things that will knock you over, but I'm going to give you a little hint. One is that a very simple Christian hymn, Christmas carol, known as Joy to the World, is Baroque. This is absolutely, it was just like when Paul Bruner sent that to me, it's like everything just crystallized, you know. It's like all the pieces just came together. Everything fell into place. The stars lined up. I understood it for the very first time, and I want to share that with you this in June. I hope you enjoy it. So I'm going to end this series with the Jesuits, and then I'm going to open up with the Jesuits. And you'll see the impact of the Jesuits, the Counter-Reformation, and all the amazing things that happen out of that event. So thank you for listening to that spiel, promoting this summer's Tuesday night program here at Unity in this room. So I hope many of you can come. We've been talking about the development of monasticism and the Friars. Now, this is such a profound moment in church history and world history that we have to spend quite a bit of time explaining what happened. Last week I was dwelling on the concept of the hermits, how this whole thing comes out of these random hermits who were rebelling against the fact that the church had become the state church. How Constantine, through the influence of his mother, just started squeezing out everything else. And within 50 years, the Christian church, this minor movement at one time, became not just the church, but the only religion, official religion of the Roman Empire. That's a stunning evolution of things. And many of the holy men who bring this forth are men who you wouldn't think would have much of an impact in the world, and yet they do. And that they did because of what they did. Now, remember our mantra, right? This is the medieval, this is the, I'll just call it the monk's mantra. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but that's what I do. And the monk's mantra is, of course, is that suffering equals holiness. The more you suffer, the holier you are, the happier makes God, everybody's good, right? And so, all these men, we talked about St. Anthony and his extraordinary work in the desert in Egypt, and how he started to bring some men together to live in a communion of hermits, which sounds like an oxymoron, but that's essentially what they did. Now, the man I want to talk about, you've heard this name before, I'm sure, San Simeon. Now, San Simeon is in the 4th century in Syria. He's a we don't know much about him. We assume he might have been a priest. He certainly was spent his life, most of his life, as a hermit. And over a period of 47 years, he decides that he's going to isolate himself from the world by sitting on top of pillars. The word for pillars is stylus.
Not long ago, Rita Levi Montalcini celebrated her.
Now, this is still the period of the Romans. There's a lot of pillars around, ruined buildings and so on. He started to sit on one that was 10 feet tall, and he graduated up to one that was about 37 feet tall. And there were a series in between. And so he's called in history Simeon Style Lighty. He's the guy that sits on top of the pillars. Now, what's interesting here, just an aside, a pillar looks a lot like a pen or a pencil. If you take it, turn on its side so that you're vertical, you can see that it's what pens were called stylus. The pen is called a stylus, and so from which we get what word? Style. There's supposed to be a Y. Style. Okay? Why? Because you make with the pen, right? You make these designs, and that's where our word style comes from. So here's Simeon Stylites. Now we have to use our imaginations here. Here he is sitting on top of these pillars, and the 110 feet, it got too crowded. People started coming and gawking at him and talking to him, and they'd ask him to pray, and they'd ask him to give a sermon, and they'd hand him food, and, you know, this kind of thing. But eventually, he kept moving higher and higher. How he got down and up, there must have been somebody that helped him. But there he is, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. Rain, hail, lightning, windstorm, he's there. Is he covered up from, does he have a little tent? No, he's just sitting there, 20 degrees below zero, 120 degrees above. He's just sitting and doing what? Suffering. It makes him happy because he can suffer. And in suffering, he gains his purity. And purity brings holiness. You see, it's a funny cycle of ideas that come together with these men, that they're trying to purify the church. Because they believe the church has been taken over by demons. The state. See, this idea that the state would control the church was an anathema to them. Just like it's an anathema to the founding fathers in America. The idea of one state would control. Or even worse, the church becomes the state. And this is exactly what happened in the Middle Ages. The church becomes the state. And so much so that at one point in medieval history, the Vatican actually rules a big chunk of Italy, right? And it's extraordinary. Now, so these guys come together, and just to remind you, individual hermits are called anchorites. Now, an anchorite then is anchored to a spot, right? It might be his cell. It could be a cave somewhere. It could be under a tree. Or it could be on top of a pillar. All these places are home, if you will, for an anchorite. And then as they come together, starting with St. Anthony's, Cenobites. So in Egypt, there are several places that claim to have the first monastery. So one year, in many trips I've taken over the year with students, I thought, well, let's go to Egypt and Israel. All right, so that was a trip. Ooh. And we went to Egypt and saw many things, of course. All of the famous pharaonic temples and artifacts, and the Cairo Museum with King Tut, you name it. And but then we wanted to go and see the first monastery. So we have a guide. Oh yes, we know the first monastery. In fact, it's where the Coptic Pope is. By the way, Coptic is Greek for Egyptian. So the Coptic religion they're still speaking the same language the Pharaoh spoke in their liturgical service. Coptic Christians in Egypt. They're still there. They're a minority, maybe 10, 15% of the population, but they still exist. So, anyway, we were going out to this place out in the desert. So, well, how far is it? Oh, about an hour. No problem. You know, we'll get out there. And you can talk to the Coptic Pope, who happens to be in residence, because this was the first monastery. He likes to isolate himself, be a hermit for a while, say, even though it's a community. I mean, again, you have to be careful how terminology is used. So we're in this bus hold maybe 25, 30 people, and we're just rolling along the highway. It's a nice highway, all paved and everything. And so I'm sitting in front with the guide, and I was looking out, and I noticed way out in front, the road ends. And we're going about 70 miles an hour. and I said to the guy, wait, the road ends up here. He said, I know. He said, well, don't we need to slow down? No problem. Okay. So, taking faith right there and just hoping for the best. I kind of grabbed on, and we hit the sand. It was like the Salt Lake, the Salt Flats in Utah, just as hard as a rock, right? We just kept going 70 miles an hour. Just kept going for, another 20 minutes or so, and we came to this little, we saw some palm trees, and there was this kind of like medieval fortress, and there, it's called a wadi. It's a little valley, and then they have, it's because they had water there. And we go in, and there they were still doing what they've been doing all this time, since the 4th and 5th century, living this life of isolation from the world, and each man living in a cell in isolation. And it just struck me when I saw that we all are in the same conundrum, right? They were perfectly happy being out in the middle of nowhere. And they were completely at peace with themselves. I talked to any number of them. Quite a few spoke English. Very scholarly men. Very interesting. And yet there they were. And what if you looked around, you say, this is the Sahara Desert. Well, actually it was the Sahara Desert. They were there, and just in peace, in harmony. So, we get all worked up about our own little personal problems, right? Think of, if I could only move to fill in the blank. I don't know how many friends I've had over the years that say, I'm going to, when we retire, boy, we're going. We're going to go there. And that's going to be the place. This is going to be, everything's going to be wonderful and perfect, right? And then I had a doctor friend in the neighborhood who came by one day. And we always visited as he walked by. And one day he said, well, I guess I'll never see you again. I said, how come? He said, well, we're moving. We're going down to, San Antonio, I think it was. Oh, really? Why? Oh, it's just, we've been counting the days. How wonderful it's going to be in San Antonio. And they ticked off all the reasons why. I said, well, I'm glad you found the perfect place. I hope you enjoy it. Oh, we will, don't you worry. So I forgot about it. 6 months later, I'm outside working, and this man walks by, the doctor. I said, doctor, what are you doing here? He said, oh, well, hi, good to see you. Yeah, we were down in San Antonio. We didn't like San Antonio. we were so happy here and didn't realize it. All our friends were here. We knew the way around. We had no friends down there. We didn't know, and we had a beautiful home, but it made no difference. And so, it just so happened, the deal fell through on the house they sold, and the house came back to him, and he just moved back into the same house.
Wow.
And picked up where he was. Now, that doesn't happen very often, right? That, to me, was kind of a morality tale of how we all do this. We all think it's going to be better over there, somewhere, right? And then and it's particularly when people spent their whole life in one place. It just always surprises me. Anyway, I want to talk to you now about monasticism, and I want to start with one of the most famous of all monastics, Saint Benedict. Now, Saint Benedict, you've heard his name because you've heard the name Benedictines and the Benedictine rule. He wrote the first rule, not necessarily the first rule, but the one that was adopted. All monastic orders after that followed the Benedictines. And Saint Benedict was very big on the idea that there would be no ranking in a monastery. This idea that everybody's equal. Egalitarianism. Unbelievable. Well, not exactly. They would have an abbot, and you had to do exactly what the abbot said, right? But in ranking, there was no ranking, right? Everybody's the same. So I guess you'd say you got the same treatment from the abbot. But You know, it's like the idea of the proletariat, you know, that everybody's somehow equal. This, of course, is one of those things that monks, you know, they're trying to live a life of complete harmony. And so it is important that nobody's above or below anybody, right? Or then there's going to be jealousy. Jealousy, of course, is the one great danger you have in any group, whether it's a family or whether it's a social group of some kind. Jealousy, right? Powerful, powerful. Hurts a lot of people. So anyway, he was against all that. Now his famous slogan, we need to talk about. Ora et labora. Ora means prayer. Now, you have a lot of words, like an oratorio. What's an oratorio? It's a prayer that's sung. It's an oratorio. And you hear them, you know, quite often in liturgical music. Or there's a certain place in a church called an oratory. And the oratory is where you pray, especially set aside for prayer. Or you have the word oratory as in speaking. You study oratory and you learn how to speak. So you go to, what's that group, Carolyn, I think somebody here, Izzy, do you belong to it? What's the name?
Toastmasters?
Huh?
Toastmasters?
Yes, Toastmasters. Is that the one you belong to?
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah, Toastmasters. I was trying to think. You know, you learn to do correct oratory, right? Really, the word is prayer, but if you think what prayer is talking. Only in this case, you're talking to God. So prayer. Now, this is what the life of a monk is. Ora et labora. Now, labora, you can figure that out. Labor, right? Work, prayer and work. So your whole life, prayer and work, prayer and work. Now, this is kind of an astonishing formula, if you think about it. I was over at Dallas Baptist University when the president got up to give a speech. And he stood up and he just said 3 words. He said, ora et labora. And I knew what that meant. Probably most people in the room didn't, but I happen to know what it meant. And I was just like, my jaw dropped, right? How does it come to pass that a Baptist president of a university is quoting St. Benedict? And then he said, ora means prayer. Yes, we need to pray. We need to pray without ceasing. We need to always be in prayer, at least in that idea of constantly communicating with God. But we need to get out and work, right? We pray for people. Well, let's go help them. We pray that people will convert. Let's go talk to them. Let's get out there. Let's do something. Amen. I thought it was one of the best talks I'd ever heard. It was about 1 minute long. You know? That doesn't have to be long, right? So anyway, St. Benedict, now, what Benedict set up, and I've got to lay this out here now. I'm going to use all these up. I'm sorry. I want to talk to you about this word, or term. Canonical hours. Now, canon comes to mean church. For example, canon law, the law of the church, right? I remember the story of Brigham Young out in Utah. The Mormons set up a separate country out there in 1848 called Deseret. Deseret. And Deseret was their world. And the the president designate was the president of the church, right? So this is, again, this idea of the church and state being one, right? And so he whatever Young said, that was canon law. Okay. That was canon law. And he would, of course, be speaking with the Lord. He was the prophet, so he had a special relationship with the Lord, and the Lord would tell him certain things. And the Lord told him to do, go west, and told him where to stop, and all of that. And the Mormons, had an extraordinary history that we won't go into, but there's certain things that echo back to the monastic, right? This idea that every Mormon is equal, right? And that they never have clergy. You know that, don't you? If you've ever been to an LDS meeting, there's no clergy. Never has. It's all lay people, right? Everybody. So, somebody this Sunday gets up and gives a little talk. And so one of the rites of passage more is when you get old enough to get up and speak in the church, right? That means you've arrived, right? So anyway, that's canon law. Well, canonical hours, then, is the idea that every 3 hours you go to the place of prayer, which means the chapel in the monastery. I can't spell with the word. Every 3 hours, you go and you pray. And what they eventually developed, about 100 years later, from St. Benedict, was to do this in musical form. So they would pray the Psalms, particularly, and they had all kinds of scriptural settings in music. And so this became known as, after St. Gregory, as Gregorian So Gregorian chant is a type of singing where it's a very limited range. You never go too high, you never go too low. You just do this very long. But the point of it, the reason for that is you want, the music is supposed to put you in this contemplative mood, in this mood where you're in harmony with the Lord. And that's why the singing will help you do that. And so Gregorian chant is extraordinarily effective in that sense, in what it does. Well, anyway, St. Gregory was the guy who became as Pope and instigated the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, the Germans. Anglo-Saxon, of course, at that time also included what is today England. So he's responsible for all that. Well, anyway, I didn't get this written down correctly, so I'm going to have to go back. On canonical hours. So you start with matins and lauds, and then what's another one? The next one is, let me think about this, prime, yeah. Now, just to give you an idea, prime means 6 a.m. in the morning. Right? These are Latin, terms. And then at 9 a.m. in the morning, you have, let me check. Oh yeah, terce. Okay, and so on all through the day. Now, I want you to think about your life. If you were a monk under St. Benedict and then under say the Gregorian system, as it were, 6 a.m. you've already been to church that day twice. See? Midnight and 3. You've seen the pictures of the monks, they're going They're all lined up. What? Huh?
They're asleep.
Yeah, it looks like it. Every 3 hours you go and you run through the Gregorian chants and all of that. Now, people complain bitterly if on Sunday morning the pastor lets the service run beyond 1 hour, right? But if you're a monk, you're going to church every 3 hours. So much for sleep. You say, well, they didn't get any sleep. Sleep didn't matter to them. They didn't care about sleep. They cared about suffering. Remember that. That's why it's so hard for us. Because see, all we care about is pleasure. Am I wrong? I mean, the thing is, are you suffering from this or that or the other problem? There's a cure. You know, take this pill, go to that doctor. And if you have any personal needs, it's always about those being fulfilled. Not in that culture. That culture is better for your soul and the souls of the people you're praying for if you get up and go to prayer. Because see, if you say, yeah, I'll go and pray in my cell, no you won't. No you won't, you'll fall asleep. But, you know, there, you know, the guy next to you keeps you going. And you get in your prayer time. This goes all the way down to number 8, which is way down, called Compline. Now, Compline is a service that you usually don't hear much about. A few Catholic churches have it, some Episcopalian churches have it, very late in the evening. I went to the University of Washington, Seattle. Every Sunday night at 10 p.m., you could find me up on Capitol Hill at the Episcopal Cathedral. And there they did Compline. You never heard anything more beautiful in your entire life. It was stunning. And you have these men who would sing in 4 parts. That's something to hear, men singing in 4 parts. So you have to have these men, I used to call them castrati, because they had to be castrated to get a voice like that. A few men, yeah, this is true. And because remember, the Sistine Chapel, there could be no women. But they wanted to have this beautiful sound, right? So some boys would be chosen, and particularly gorgeous boys would be castrated. Called castrato. They were still castrating into the 20th century. There is a record done by Edison of a castrato singing. And I heard that recorded. That voice, if you didn't know it was a man, you would say that's the highest soprano you've ever heard in your life. It's ethereal. You know, it's such a beautiful sound. But that's what they do to get that, to have that in there. Hearkening back, you know, to that mystery religion of the mother goddess Cybele, where all the priests had to be castrated so they could become priestesses, right? Talk about suffering. Okay. Now, every 3 hours. And so after you've done this a few years, you know, you can just do it literally in your sleep, right? You just come and do it. So this takes, probably by the time you go, do the service, come back about an hour. So 8 hours are already gone. So in the other 8 hours, you have to do your work. And you have to do the meals. Now you can do that, but you know, you have to be very efficient. Oh, and by the way, another thing about suffering, they didn't like you to enjoy yourself, obviously. So at meals, you're sitting with your brethren having a meal in the refectory. Refectory is what you call the place you have meals in a monastery. And there, you're not allowed to talk, right? So you have to eat your meal, but you can't socialize. How come? Well, because they'll have somebody reading the scripture to you during the meals. So you have your 3 square meals a day. And what do you do? What's your job? Well, your job might be doing the calligraphy on one of those gorgeous Bibles from the Middle Ages, before printing. Illuminated text. They'd use gilding, gold paint, and just unbelievably gorgeous, right? And so a lot of them do that. Some would make wine, some make cheese, some would do this, some would do that. But always in the confines of the monastery. And one terrible thing that happened during the Middle Ages, these guys were so busy, and during feudalism, so they just have some serfs. They owned all this land. They owned, at one point in certain parts of Europe, owned up to 1/3 of the land in these countries. And they'd have serfs doing a lot of the work because they didn't have time, right? They're doing all this praying. I thought that was very awful that they did that, but that's the way it goes. Now, over the years, there were other kind of monastic movements. And I want to tell you about these before I run out of time. Oh my God. Okay. I'm going to tell you about I'll tell you one called Cluny. It's in France. This is a monastery that then became a monastic movement. So you have branches. You know, Jimmy, how the Christian Scientists only have one church, the Mother Church in Boston, which if you haven't seen, you haven't lived. If you want to enjoy yourself, now I understand, we're not talking about enjoyment here. If you want to enjoy yourself, I want you to go to Boston, I want you to go to the Back Bay, I want you to go to the Mother Church, and then I want you to walk across the street, and they have there a stained glass, about twice as big as this room. The stained glass globe that was created in 1938, and you walk into it, like right through the middle. In other words, they have a bridge. You walk in here and you can look up, you can look down, and you see the world as it was in 1938, inside out, in stained glass. Oh, it's so breathtaking. And they only let you, you only get a few minutes, maybe 15 minutes. And I just want to stay there. So I went back and did it again and did it again, and so on. And
You wanted more suffering.
Yeah. Jimmy and I have talked about this subject a lot, that, it's funny, what one man's suffering is somebody else's happiness, right? And so when I talk to you about holiness and suffering, I'm talking about from our point of view. From their point of view, suffering is glory, right? It's great. But see, we don't want to suffer. We hate suffering. And so from our point of view, we can't spiritually get very far ahead, right? I know you've got to see the bishop. Tell him hello, please. Anyway, Cluny. Here's what I want to tell you about Cluny. Cluny was then a monastery that had little satellites, hundreds of them, all over Europe, right? And Cluny had an enormous influence. I don't know how many popes came from Cluny, but they're called the Cluniacs. Anyway, their deal was all ora, no labora. In other words, they just prayed. In other words, they did the canonical hours, but they go back to their cell and then they pray. And then they go, no, that's all they do. It don't work. Somebody else does the work. And that seemed to me, that's kind of fun. Anyway, it is from Cluny that one of the popes comes, and this pope, I'm sure you've heard of this guy, he was Urban II. And in 1095, he declares the Crusades. Now this had a tremendous, tremendous impact. And so what happens is this. The Crusades, 200 years of struggle, battle, war, fighting, to bring the Holy Land and keep the Holy Land in the hands of Christians. Well, he called it in 1095 by 1097, they're in Jerusalem, bathed in blood, but they took at just tremendous cost, right? And there were, I don't know, there are many, many, many crusades. There's different counts depending on how you look at it. But what I want to talk about is during the Crusader period, you have the rise of certain orders. Now, one of these orders, again, by the way, these monastic orders, the Cluniacs, these are all reformed. They're all trying to do the same thing. They're all trying to get back to the original monasticism of St. Anthony. In other words, they're trying to get back to a pure form of it. And one of these purified monks called the Cistercian, the Cistercians were very upset that so many of these orders were starting to become loose. They're not following the canonical hours. They're not doing their praying. They're not doing their work. In fact, they're also wearing fancy clothes, wearing shoes, for goodness sake. Oh no, bad. And they reformed. They're a reform movement. Anyway, nobody would have ever heard of Cistercians, though, except for this man, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Something like that. Saint Bernard, by the way, you know Saint Bernard because you've heard of the dog called the Saint Bernard, right? To go out and help people. See, there was a Cistercian monastery up in the Alps, and the Saint Bernards would go out. They'd smell. The monks would take them out, and they would smell. And so they'd smell, oh, there's a human down there, and dig down. And this little barrel they had, you know, of some wine to kind of get them warmed up again. Yeah. It's amazing how that has survived. Anyway, St. Bernard was one of these meteorites that comes every so often, just blazing in the sky. He had a profound influence to this day. And let me tell you why. He was the major light of the Cistercians, but the order that he... Yeah, I knew this was going to have to happen. Yeah. Sorry, Carolyn. I'm very sorry about this. Okay, so you have in the Crusades, the strangest military, I should say, strangest religious organization I think that ever came about, and that is the military orders. Now, what's a military order? It's a bunch of monks who decide that they are going to be soldiers, that they are going to be, their job is to go to the Holy Land and to die, if necessary, to protect the Holy Land and keep it open for Christians to come. And there's places. All right? So there were three famous ones. I want to talk about one mainly. Yeah, there's more paper. I know. Yeah. Okay.
We have a few minutes.
I know, Carolyn. Carolyn's hook gets longer every year. This is bad. All right. So we have the famous Hospitallers of St. John, an order that was a military order. In other words, if necessary, they put on their armor, go out, kill as many Saracens as they could. And the Knights Hospitaller eventually became a charitable order. In fact, it wasn't too many years ago here in Dallas, I was invited to the Hospitaller Christmas party and gave a talk on the history of the Hospitallers. Very strange that that would happen. But then, anyway, then there's the Teutonic Knights. Now, the Teutonic Knights, same idea, but they speak German, so they kind of separate themselves from the French and the English. The Teutonic Knights, after the war is over, the Crusade is over, go back to what is known as Prussia. They become the military in Prussia. Their sign is the Black Cross. We know it as the Iron Cross. And they fight for German nationalism, in this case Prussian nationalism. By the way, the capital of Prussia is Berlin, give you a hint how important this is. And the Teutonic Knights, to this day, are remembered in every military machine of the German army. Has the cross, the Black Cross on it, the Iron Cross. And the highest military award given in the German military today is the Iron Cross. All going back to these Teutonic Knights, extraordinarily important. But the most important are the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar. Now, Jimmy could come up here and take over and he could talk to you one whole hour just about the Knights Templar and the influence on the world. Now, but let me give it to you quick. The Knights Templar were called that because they had their headquarters up on Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And they became famous in battle as warriors. And they spread, they had Knights Templar monastery all over the world. And when they were in the Holy Land, they had this problem of transferring money, gold coins primarily. And so they came up with a system, and that was this. So you could go walk into the temple in London. They called their churches temples. Again, Knight Templar. And you could walk in the church in London and carry 100 gold pieces. And those 100 gold pieces, then, they would give you a paper that they had it. You could carry that when you went on your crusade all the way to Jerusalem, and you could hand them that, and they'd give you 100 gold coins. We know that as checking or traveler's checks, right? They invented it. So they became, because of this, they always charged a little fee to do this, and they became incredibly wealthy. And so the Catholic Church, the Pope, and the King of France decided that the Knights Templars had to go. So on Friday the 13th, which is, by the way, why Friday the 13th is always thought of an unlucky day, the Catholic Church and the army, military of France went and arrested all the Knights Templar. And it took a while to go through the whole process, but they eventually burned them all at the stake. The most famous being a man by the name of Jacques de Molay. The Knights Templar, though were not attacked in England, Scotland, were not attacked in isolated countries, and they went underground. And it took about 100 years for them to rise from the ashes. And they did. Only they rose from the ashes under a name that you would be surprised to hear. And that is the Masonic orders. You know, in Dallas, Scottish Rite, York Rite, all of these derived from the death and then resurrection of the Knights Templar. And the Masonics have had just such an enormous influence. Since I only have time for one, Carolyn, I'll just mention this. So many of our founding fathers were Masonic brothers, including Washington, Lafayette from Adams, Monroe, Madison, Jefferson even wore, they have a picture of him and Jefferson wearing his Masonic apron. Now, I still haven't gotten to the Friars. So I will start next week telling you the incredible story, how this monastic, how this group rose up, and then its influence, and how it got endlessly copied, and how that's impacted us. In fact, one of the most important moments in Western history is the creation of the Friars, for what impact. And I'll remind you of the cliffhanger that I'm going to answer on the 4th week, or Sunday. What two great men changed the course of history? Who were friars? Not including St. Francis of Assisi. What two friars changed the course of history? We'll get to that in 2 weeks. Hope you can come next week. See you then. Thank you.